It was supposed to be a quiet evening. I was cooking dinner for the family, the usual noise of plates and soft music filling the kitchen. The smell of roasted chicken mixed with garlic and lemon drifted through the air. Everything felt normal, until it didn't. I was chopping vegetables when I heard voices from the hallway. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. A low whisper, maybe a phone call. But then I caught the words, clear, sharp, like glass breaking inside my mind. Someone said, "Why is she still breathing? Didn't you put poison in her juice?" For a few seconds, I froze. The knife slipped slightly in my hand, grazing my finger, but I didn't feel the sting. My body just went cold. The voice sounded familiar. Too familiar. It came from the living room, where the laughter had been just a moment ago. My first thought was that I'd misunderstood, that maybe they were watching something on TV. A movie. A joke. Anything but what it really sounded like. I told myself to stay calm. I took a deep breath and pretended to keep cooking, but my heart was beating too fast, loud enough to drown out every other sound. I listened carefully. The voices lowered again, muffled by the wall. I couldn't make out the words this time, just the tone. Tense, urgent, like something being planned in a hurry. For the first time in years, my own home felt unsafe. I finished dinner in silence, every movement mechanical, turning off the oven, setting the table, pouring the juice. My hands were steady, but my mind wasn't. I watched them eat, watched the way they smiled, how easily they spoke to each other. No one looked at me any differently, but every word felt heavy now, every glance suspicious. When I reached for my glass of juice, I hesitated. The memory of that sentence echoed again. Poison in her juice. My throat tightened. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but still, I didn't drink. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the shadows on the wall. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the old clock in the hall. I tried to convince myself it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe it really was something from a movie playing in the next room. Maybe I'd heard wrong. But then I remembered the tone, the way the words had been whispered, not spoken. There was intent in them, fear, urgency. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. The cup was warm between my palms, but I couldn't stop shaking. My mind kept replaying the scene, the voices, the pause, the silence that followed. When the others came downstairs, I watched them carefully. Their smiles looked the same, their gestures normal, but I noticed small things now, a quick look between them, a too casual question about how I felt, the way one of them moved my cup slightly to the side before I touched it. Every detail felt loaded. After breakfast, I pretended to forget my phone on the counter and walked out to the yard. From there, through the kitchen window, I could see them talking again. Their heads leaned close, their lips moving fast. One of them glanced toward the window. I stepped back quickly before they could see me watching. For the rest of the morning, I tried to act normal. I cleaned, folded laundry, kept the radio on for noise. But everything I did felt like pretending to be alive while waiting for something invisible to strike. By afternoon, I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was imagining things. People don't just poison family members, not in real life. That kind of thing belonged to crime shows, not to kitchens filled with lemon-scented dish soap and folded napkins. Still, the unease wouldn't leave. That night, I poured the juice down the sink when no one was looking. The sound of it swirling down the drain was oddly satisfying, like a small act of survival. But the next morning, when I opened the fridge, there was a new bottle. The same brand, the same flavor, sitting right at the front like it had been placed there deliberately. My stomach tightened. I tried to remember if anyone had gone out last night, but I couldn't. I'd gone to bed early, but not to sleep, just to hide under the blanket and pretend everything was fine. I stood there staring at that bottle for a long time. The air in the kitchen felt thick, too still. That's when I realized something. This wasn't random. Someone had replaced it, and that meant someone wanted me to drink it. I took it out, slowly, my hands trembling just a little. The label was slightly crooked, as if it had been peeled off and stuck back on. A faint line of glue ran down the side. I put it back carefully, closed the fridge, and leaned against the counter. My reflection in the microwave looked pale, foreign. I didn't know what scared me more, the thought that someone wanted me dead, or the possibility that I was losing my mind. That day I stayed quiet, pretending everything was normal. I smiled when they spoke to me, laughed at their stories, but my mind was elsewhere, counting movements, memorizing details. The more I watched, the more wrong everything felt. The glances, the whispers, the little things that didn't used to stand out now screamed for attention. I told myself I needed proof. The next morning, I decided I'd find it. I woke up early that morning before the sun. The house was quiet, the air heavy and still. I could hear faint breathing from the next room, steady and calm, like nothing in the world was wrong. But my chest felt tight, like something inside me already knew the day would bring no peace. I moved through the kitchen on tiptoe, careful not to wake anyone. The bottle of juice was still there, waiting in the fridge. Condensation slid down its side, catching the light. I stared at it for a long time. I wanted to throw it away again, but I needed proof this time. So I poured a small amount into a clear glass, set it on the counter, and watched it. It looked normal. Bright orange, sweet-smelling, harmless. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of that whisper, poison in her juice. I took a spoon from the drawer and dipped it just enough to taste the edge of the liquid, but I stopped myself before it touched my lips. My hands were shaking too much. I needed someone to test it, but who could I trust? I couldn't just walk into a lab and say, "I think my family is trying to kill me." They'd think I was insane. Maybe I was. I poured the glass back into the bottle, careful not to spill a drop, then closed the cap tightly. When everyone else woke up, I acted like nothing was wrong. I made breakfast, asked about their plans, smiled in all the right places. But while they ate, I noticed small details. Too many glances exchanged, a quick whisper when I turned away, someone moving my plate an inch to the side. I felt invisible and watched at the same time. After they left the table, I stayed behind, pretending to clean. That's when I saw it, the edge of a folded paper tucked under a napkin holder. My hands felt cold as I pulled it out. It was a shopping list written in familiar handwriting, but the last line wasn't groceries. It said, "Pick up more powder, same as before." No name, no explanation, just that one sentence. I folded it back carefully, sliding it into my pocket. For the rest of the day, my thoughts twisted between fear and disbelief. I wanted to believe it was all innocent, but the way the words were written, quick, almost desperate, it didn't feel like a note about sugar or spices. That afternoon, I went through the trash outside. The cold air bit my fingers as I searched through the bags. I found an empty packet of powdered supplements I didn't recognize. The label was half torn, but one word was still visible. Toxic if swallowed. I froze. My heartbeat roared in my ears. I looked toward the house. The curtains in the living room shifted slightly, like someone had just let them fall back into place. I didn't stay outside long after that. Inside, the air felt thicker, like the walls were breathing. I could feel eyes on me even when I was alone. Every sound, a creak, a breath, a door closing, made my skin prickle. That night, I hid the note and the torn packet under my mattress. Then I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between my heartbeats. When morning came, I pretended to sleep as footsteps passed my door. I heard hushed voices again, low but sharp. One said something about time and dosage. The other responded, too quiet to catch. My throat went dry. I waited until the house emptied out. Then I went to the kitchen again, this time with gloves on. I took a small plastic bag, poured some of the juice into it, and sealed it. I didn't know where I'd bring it yet, but I needed to hold something real, something that could prove I wasn't imagining all this. I hid the bag in my purse and drove to the nearest pharmacy. The man behind the counter asked if I needed help. My voice shook when I said I was looking for somewhere to test a liquid for contamination. He stared at me for a second, confused, then scribbled down the address of a small private clinic downtown. I thanked him and left, my hand still trembling. The clinic was quiet, almost empty. A woman at the front desk looked at me with polite curiosity when I told her what I needed. I said it was for a pet, a lie that came out too easily. She nodded, took the bag, and said results would be ready the next morning. When I stepped back into the daylight, I felt lighter. For the first time in days, I had done something. I had moved, but when I got home, there was a car parked across the street. Dark windows, engine off. I stood there for a while, pretending to check my mailbox, but I could feel it. That pressure of being watched. When I finally went inside, my palms were slick with sweat. Dinner that night was tense. No one said anything strange, but silence hung between every word. I kept my eyes on my plate, noticing again how they watched me. When I stood to clear the dishes, someone offered to pour me a drink. The same juice. I smiled and said maybe later. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time. I could hear faint steps outside around midnight. Soft, slow, deliberate. They stopped right by my door, then turned away. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening to the sound of retreating feet. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the doorknob just to stay steady. The next morning, I was going to get my proof. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Someone in my house wanted me dead. The morning came gray and thin, the sky stretched like dull metal over the street. I barely slept. I drove to the clinic before it even opened, the small plastic bag sealed tight inside my purse. My hands felt numb on the steering wheel. When I walked in, the woman at the desk recognized me right away. She went into the back without saying much and came out holding a folder. She said the technician wanted to see me in person. My stomach dropped. He was a quiet man with tired eyes. His office smelled of coffee and disinfectant. He asked if I'd brought the sample from the same batch. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He flipped through the papers and pushed one toward me. There were words and numbers I didn't understand, but he pointed to a line near the bottom. The concentration of ethylene glycol is very high, he said. That's antifreeze. It's deadly. Everything around me went still. The sound of his voice blurred, the walls seemed to fade. I sat there staring at that single word, deadly. He asked where I'd gotten the sample. I told him it was from home, but not much else. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he said I should go to the police. I thanked him, folded the paper, and walked out into the cold air before I could fall apart. Outside, the world looked the same, cars, trees, people, but it all felt wrong now. The sun seemed too bright, the noise too sharp. I sat in the car, the report shaking in my hand. There it was. Proof. Real, printed proof that someone had put poison in the juice I was meant to drink. I thought about every moment from the last few days, the whispers, the glances, the quiet question. Why is she still breathing? There was no more room for doubt. I drove home slowly, thinking, planning. I couldn't go to the police yet, not without knowing who exactly was behind it. If I accused the wrong person, they'd know I was onto them. When I pulled into the driveway, the same dark car was parked across the street again. It wasn't hiding anymore. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and something metallic. Everyone was already in the kitchen. They greeted me like nothing had happened. Smiles, small talk, the rhythm of a family morning. One of them asked where I'd been. I said I'd gone for a walk. The lie came out smooth, easy. While they ate, I slipped the folded report into the lining of my jacket. My hands itched to run, but I stayed calm. I needed to pack quietly, wait for the right moment. I went upstairs pretending to look for laundry. My heart pounded so hard it felt like the whole hallway could hear it. I grabbed a small bag and started filling it. Some cash, my ID, a few clothes. The house creaked below me. Footsteps moved from room to room. Then a knock at my door. Gentle. Too gentle. They asked if I wanted tea. I said no, that I felt tired. There was a pause on the other side of the door, long enough to make me stop breathing. And then footsteps retreating. I waited another 5 minutes before slipping out through the back. The air outside was cold, sharp against my face. I could smell rain in the wind. I moved fast through the yard, down the side street. My car was still in the driveway, so I walked instead, blending into the morning traffic until I reached the gas station a few blocks away. I used a payphone to call a taxi. While I waited, I caught my reflection in the glass. Pale, hollow-eyed, older somehow. Fear does that. The taxi came, a dented yellow sedan with a driver who didn't ask questions. I told him to take me to a motel on the other side of town, anywhere far enough to make me disappear for a while. The drive felt endless. Every car that passed looked suspicious, every turn too sharp. The driver hummed softly, off-key, and it almost calmed me. At the motel, I paid in cash. The room smelled of bleach and old curtains, but at least it had locks. I slid the chain across the door and sat on the bed, staring at the report again. The black letters swam on the page, but the meaning stayed burned into my mind. Antifreeze. Deadly. I thought about who could have done it. There were two possibilities, both people I'd known my whole life. One had access to everything in the kitchen, the other had a reason to want me gone. That night, I didn't sleep. I wrote everything down in a notebook. The words I'd heard, the bottle, the note under the napkin, the car. I wrote until my hand cramped. Around midnight, I heard something outside. A car door closing, then footsteps. I turned off the light and crawled to the window. The parking lot was half empty, but near the edge, a car idled, the same dark color, the same shape. Someone got out, standing in the shadow of the street lamp. I couldn't see the face, but the posture was familiar. Shoulders slightly hunched, hands in pockets. He stood there for a while, just looking at the motel building, then turned and got back into the car. When the headlights swept across the window, I saw the license plate, the same one from across my street. I stayed up till dawn, heart racing, every muscle tense. The next morning, I knew I couldn't keep running forever. I needed help, and not just from strangers. I needed someone who would believe me, and someone who could fight back. I folded the report into my bag, took one last look around the room, and walked out. This time, I wasn't just escaping. I was going to fight. By the second morning at the motel, the walls felt smaller, the air thicker. I couldn't stay there much longer. Every sound outside made me jump. Doors slamming, tires crunching on gravel, footsteps in the corridor. When the sun came up, I packed again. I needed food, water, a plan. The small grocery store across the street looked harmless enough. I went there, keeping my head down, pretending to browse. That's where I saw him. My neighbor from a few houses down, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. His name was Ben. He'd always been polite, quiet, the kind of man who fixed his own car and mowed his lawn at sunrise. I remembered hearing once that he used to be a police officer before retiring early. He recognized me right away. His face shifted from surprise to concern when he noticed the way I looked, pale, exhausted, almost hollow. He asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, just traveling, but my voice cracked halfway through. He didn't press. He just nodded and said, "If you ever need to talk, you know where I live." Those words stuck. That afternoon, I drove back toward my neighborhood, staying a few blocks away, watching from the corner. The dark car was gone. The street looked calm, ordinary, but I didn't go home. Instead, I parked near Ben's house and waited until I saw him outside fixing his mailbox.
I walked up slowly, feeling like every step was a risk. I told him I needed help, real help, and that I didn't know who else to trust. He didn't interrupt or ask for proof. He just opened his gate and said, "Come in." His kitchen smelled like coffee and old wood. I sat at the table and told him everything, the voices, the bottle, the clinic, the test results. He listened quietly, no judgment, just those steady eyes watching me. When I handed him the report, he read it twice, jaw tightening. Then he said something that made my stomach twist. "If that's real," he said, "you can't go back there. Not even to grab your things. You need to stay somewhere safe." I told him about the car that kept following me, the notes, the whispers. He nodded again, the way people do when they've already decided to act. He said he still had a few friends who owed him favors, people who worked in law enforcement but didn't always follow the rules too closely.
He made a few calls while I sat there staring at my hands. I couldn't hear what he said, only bits and pieces. My name, the words lab report, domestic threat, keep it quiet. When he hung up, he told me we'd need more than a paper to make this stick. We needed a direct connection. Fingerprints, receipts, something physical from whoever handled that bottle. The thought of going back into that house made my stomach twist, but I said yes. That night we waited until it was late. Ben drove, lights off until we turned onto my street. The house looked peaceful, curtains drawn, porch light glowing softly. I almost laughed at how normal it appeared. We parked 2 houses down and walked quietly through the yard. The grass was wet, the air sharp with the smell of rain. My hands trembled so hard I had to keep them in my pockets. Inside, everything was dark. I'd hidden a spare key under the planter by the back door. It was still there. When I turned the handle, the faint click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in my ears. The kitchen looked untouched, dishes stacked neatly, fruit bowl full, that same bottle of juice sitting in the fridge door. I opened it carefully, using a towel so I wouldn't leave prints. Ben shone a small flashlight across the counter, searching for anything unusual. He pointed to a faint white residue near the cutting board, dust-like, almost invisible. He scraped a sample into a small plastic bag. Then we heard it, a car door outside, too close. We froze. The front gate creaked. Ben whispered that we needed to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Through the kitchen window, I saw shadows, 2 figures moving across the yard. He grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back door, just as the porch light flicked on. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. We slipped out, running through the narrow alley behind the fence. When we reached his truck, he told me not to look back, but I did. The curtain in my bedroom window was pulled aside, and a face watched us leave. We didn't stop until we were miles away. The city lights blurred by, the engine humming low. I sat in silence, clutching the small bag with the residue like it was my last lifeline. At his house, Ben locked every door and drew the curtains. He said he'd drop the sample off the next morning to his friend at the lab. I nodded, still shaking. Before I went to the guest room, he told me something that stayed with me. "People who do things like this," he said quietly, "they always think they're smarter than everyone else. But they get sloppy when someone fights back." I lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, repeating those words over and over. They get sloppy when someone fights back. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was finally time to stop being afraid. For the first time, I felt a small, hard spark of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. I still didn't know how deep this went or how far they'd go to finish what they'd started, but now I had someone on my side, someone real. And that changed everything. Morning came gray and heavy. Ben was already awake, pacing the kitchen, coffee untouched on the counter. He looked like a man who'd gone back to an old job he never wanted to see again. He said he'd called his friend in the city, someone who worked quietly inside the state lab. They could run the residue sample right away. No paperwork, no waiting. I handed him the bag, the faint dust inside glinting under the light.
We drove in silence, the road cut through fog and half-dead pines. I watched our reflection in the windshield, pale and tense. Every car that followed made my throat tighten. The lab was hidden behind a brick warehouse, no sign on the door. Inside, the air smelled like chemicals and old coffee. A woman in a white coat met us, spoke briefly with Ben, and took the sample. She said it would only take an hour. We waited in the hallway, the hum of machines filling the silence. I tried to steady my hands, but they wouldn't stop trembling. Ben watched the door, eyes sharp, jaw set. When the woman came back, her face was pale. She handed Ben a sheet of paper and whispered something I couldn't catch. He read it once, then looked at me. "It's the same substance as before," he said. "Antifreeze, same compound, same brand." My stomach turned. "Can they trace who bought it?" I asked.
He nodded slowly. They already did. It's registered. A controlled item. The receipt was logged under a store account. Your family's hardware store card. The room seemed to tilt. It wasn't random anymore. It was proof. Proof that someone inside my house had bought the poison. Ben folded the paper carefully, like something that could burn through skin. He said we had to act fast, before they realized I was alive and knew everything. But it was already too late for that. As we stepped outside, I saw it. The same dark car parked across the street. This time the engine was running. Ben swore under his breath. We got into his truck, doors slamming hard. The car pulled out too, headlights flashing once before following. The chase wasn't fast, but it was close. Every turn we took, they matched. Ben kept his voice low, telling me to stay calm, to look for open roads. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. After 10 minutes, he turned suddenly onto a dirt road that cut through a construction site. Gravel sprayed under the tires. The car behind us slowed, then stopped. We watched its headlights vanish behind a mound of dirt. Ben exhaled, gripping the wheel. "They're watching you," he said. "Not trying to kill you yet, just waiting." We didn't go back to his house that night. He took me to a cabin outside town, one he used during hunting season. It was small, cold, surrounded by pines, but it felt safer than anywhere else. Inside, I sat by the window while he made calls again. He spoke quietly, using words like surveillance, protective custody, sealed warrant. When he hung up, he said his friend at the precinct was going to start an investigation quietly, using the evidence from the lab. I nodded, staring at the darkness outside. The trees looked alive, shifting in the wind. Somewhere in that blackness, a pair of headlights blinked once and disappeared. Ben told me not to worry, but I could see the tension in his hands. He cleaned his old revolver that night, said it was habit, nothing more. I tried to sleep on the couch, but every creak of the cabin made my body flinch. Sometime after midnight, I heard a noise outside, a branch snapping, then the faint sound of footsteps on gravel. I sat up, heart hammering. Ben was already awake, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. He motioned for me to stay still. The sound moved around the cabin slowly, careful and deliberate. Then it stopped near the window. The beam of his flashlight cut across the glass, catching a shadow, a face for just a split second before it vanished into the trees. We waited, listening to the engine start in the distance. The sound faded until the forest went still again. Ben lowered the gun, exhaling. "They know where we are," he said quietly. I looked at him and saw something change in his expression, not fear, but resolve. He told me it was time to stop hiding. The next morning, we'd go to the police directly, hand over everything, the reports, the receipts, the names. But as I lay there, trying to rest, I couldn't shake one thought. Someone inside my family had done this. Someone I had trusted enough to share every meal, every laugh, every secret. And once the police got involved, there would be no way to go back to who I'd been before. That night was the first time I felt the full weight of it. Not just fear, but betrayal that cut so deep it almost felt physical. I turned toward the window and watched the first thin light of dawn stretch across the trees. My hands were steady now. My fear had turned into something else, something sharper. I wasn't the same woman who froze in her kitchen that first night. Now I was ready. By sunrise, the sky had turned a washed-out blue, the kind that makes everything look unreal. I barely felt the cold anymore. Ben drove straight into the city, the back of the truck filled with folders and envelopes, everything we had gathered so far. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the tires on wet asphalt. Every few miles I caught him checking the mirrors. The dark car didn't follow this time, but we both knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The police station sat on a corner near the river, a square brick building that looked more tired than dangerous. Inside, the air smelled of paper and burnt coffee. Ben's friend, Detective Mills, met us near the door. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, eyes sharp but kind. He shook my hand gently, like I was something breakable. Ben gave him the lab reports, the photos, the shopping list, the bag of residue. Mills looked through each piece slowly, no interruptions. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. "This isn't paranoia," he said quietly. "This is attempted murder." Hearing it out loud made my stomach twist. He said the poison had been purchased 3 times in the last month using our family's hardware account. One of the signatures matched my husband's initials, the same handwriting that had left that note under the napkin holder. Ben's face darkened. He asked if they could move fast, before he had a chance to destroy evidence or disappear. Mills nodded and said he'd file the report immediately, but he warned us. "If he suspects you've gone to the police, it could get ugly before it gets better." I signed the paperwork with a shaking hand. The pen scratched against the form like a blade. They told me to stay in protective housing for a few days. I refused. I couldn't hide forever. I wanted to see this through. That evening, Mills called. He said they'd already spoken to the store manager and confirmed the purchases. My husband had used his loyalty card, his own ID. There were even security camera clips of him buying the containers, loading them into the car. I listened in silence as the truth unfolded piece by piece. He'd done it himself. The same man who used to kiss me goodnight, who once fixed my broken chair, who smiled across the table while asking if I liked the juice. I didn't remember hanging up. I just sat there, the phone heavy in my lap. Ben was beside me, but his voice sounded far away. I felt empty, as if my body had turned into air. Later that night, Mills called again. They'd gone to question him. He wasn't home. His car was missing. My pulse started racing again, a deep pounding in my ears. Ben locked the doors and checked the windows twice. He told me not to panic, but his own voice was tight. We waited through the night, lights off, the gun resting on the table between us. The cabin creaked with the wind. Every sound outside felt deliberate, planned. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost didn't look, but curiosity won. The message was short. "You shouldn't have gone to them." My throat closed. I showed it to Ben. He read it once, said nothing, then deleted it. He told me to rest, but I couldn't. Every hour stretched longer. The storm outside built slowly, wind scraping branches against the roof, rain tapping the windows. It felt like the world was holding its breath. By dawn, there was still no word from the police. Ben brewed coffee that neither of us drank. When the phone finally rang, I jumped. Mills said they'd found the car, abandoned near the forest line, not far from the cabin. Inside, they'd discovered the same bottle of juice, unopened, labeled, ready. They were sending a team to sweep the area. He told us to stay put until they arrived. But the sound of branches snapping outside told us we were already out of time. Ben grabbed the gun and motioned for me to move to the back room. My body moved on instinct, every muscle tight. The air in the cabin changed, heavier, sharper. I heard footsteps outside again, slower this time, deliberate. The doorknob turned once, lightly. Ben raised the weapon, voice low but steady. The door creaked. For a second, everything was silent except the rain. Then a shape filled the doorway. Soaked clothes, eyes wide and unrecognizable. It was him. My husband stood there, breathing hard, rainwater running down his face. He looked like a stranger wearing his skin. He said something, low and sharp, but I couldn't process the words. Ben told him to drop whatever he was holding. He smiled instead, that same calm, polite smile he'd used 1,000 times. That's when I saw it. The small bottle in his hand, capped, identical to the one in our fridge. Ben shouted. The sound of thunder cracked through the forest as lightning lit the room. And in that frozen flash, I understood everything. The months of coldness, the strange errands, the tension that had crept into our home. He hadn't just tried to kill me for money or hatred. He'd done it because he could, because somewhere along the way I'd stopped being a person to him and had become a problem to solve.
Ben fired a warning shot into the floor. My husband didn't move. He looked at me, really looked, and for a moment, his face softened. Then he dropped the bottle. It shattered on the floor, splashing pale liquid across the wood. Ben lunged forward, knocking him down. The fight was fast, brutal. 2 bodies crashing against furniture, the sound of fists and glass. I stood frozen until the sirens cut through the storm. Blue lights flickered through the windows. Mills and 2 officers burst inside, pulling them apart. My husband hit the ground hard, his hands twisting behind his back. The bottle lay broken beside him, its poison seeping into the cracks of the floorboards. I stood there shaking, unable to move, until Mills placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. But even as I heard those words, I knew it wasn't. Not yet. The fear had ended, yes, but what came next would be something entirely different.
I wasn't the woman he'd left trembling in that kitchen anymore. I wasn't afraid of the silence. I was ready to speak. By the time the sun came up, the rain had stopped. The forest around the cabin smelled of mud and wet pine. Police cars still lined the dirt road, their lights pulsing softly against the trees. I sat on the back steps of the porch, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, watching the steam rise from the ground. Inside, officers moved quietly, taking photos, bagging evidence. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of them through the window. Gloves, cameras, voices that stayed calm even when they found shards of glass still glistening on the floor. Ben stood a few yards away, talking to Mills. Their words didn't reach me, but I could read the weight of them in their faces. When Mills finally came over, he crouched down beside me. His voice was gentle, stripped of all the formal tone from earlier. He said they had my husband in custody and that he'd already started talking. The words didn't feel real. He said the motive was simple, almost pathetic in its cruelty. Money, life insurance, the lottery payout I'd never claimed, the property we owned together. It wasn't passion or anger, just greed wrapped in calm calculation. He'd planned it for months, slowly building the story of my illness, buying small amounts of antifreeze at different stores, mixing it into the things I drank most often. He'd kept the dosage low at first, to make it look like exhaustion. Then he'd planned to increase it, slow enough to seem natural, quiet enough to be invisible. But he'd made one mistake. He'd talked too loudly that night in the hallway. That's all it took. As Mills spoke, I could feel a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't relief. It was something emptier, colder, like my body had run out of ways to feel fear. He asked if I wanted to see him, to identify him officially. I said no. I'd already seen enough. Ben came over after Mills left. He looked tired, older somehow, but steady. He said I'd saved myself long before anyone else stepped in. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I thanked him anyway. Later, they drove me into town to give a formal statement. The room was small, the walls gray, the air too cold. I told the story again, from the night I heard those words to the chase, the cabin, the shattered bottle. My voice stayed even, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. When I finished, Mills nodded and said they had everything they needed. I could rest now. I didn't know how. They offered to put me in a safe house for a few weeks. I declined. I just wanted to go somewhere that didn't smell like bleach or fear. Ben gave me his spare keys and told me to stay at his place until I figured out what came next. That night, his house was quiet. No creaking floors, no hidden whispers, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of crickets. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I kept thinking about all the times I'd missed the signs, the late nights, the locked drawers, the sudden coldness that had crept into his eyes months before. I'd told myself it was work, stress, life. But maybe I'd always known something was wrong and hadn't wanted to see it. Grief didn't come like I expected. There were no tears, no collapse. Just a slow, aching emptiness, like the house after everyone leaves.
The next morning, I went back to the clinic, the same one that had tested the juice. I wanted to thank them, to see the technician again. But the woman at the front desk said she'd transferred to another state. The office looked different now, cleaner, emptier. I left without saying anything. On the way back, I stopped at the small park near the highway. The air smelled of wet leaves. I sat on a bench and watched people pass by. Strangers with normal lives, coffee cups in hand, conversations light and careless. For the first time in months, I felt invisible in a good way. A few days later, Mills called again. He said the case would go to trial soon, but it wouldn't take long. The evidence was too strong. There were fingerprints, receipts, phone records, even text messages to a friend where my husband had bragged about solving his financial problems.
When I hung up, I realized that the story was no longer mine alone. It had become a record, a file, a series of exhibits and dates. But I was still here, still breathing. That night, I slept for the first time without waking from nightmares. In the morning, sunlight spilled across the floor in thin gold lines. I opened the window, letting the air rush in. It smelled clean. Ben made breakfast and didn't ask how I felt. He didn't need to. We both knew that healing wasn't a straight road. It was a long walk through silence. Before he left for the day, he said something I won't forget. "You've already won. You just have to keep living like it." I stayed by the window long after he was gone, watching the trees move in the wind. For the first time, the sound didn't make me flinch. Somewhere deep inside, the fear that had ruled every breath began to lose its hold. I wasn't healed yet, but I was finally facing forward. The courthouse looked smaller than I expected. Just a square building of gray stone and glass, ordinary enough to make everything that happened inside feel impossible. The air smelled of paper and rain. Reporters waited by the steps, their umbrellas black against the sky. I kept my head down as I walked past. Inside, the hallway buzzed with low voices. Ben was already there, standing beside Mills. He gave me a nod, steady, reassuring. I didn't need words. The hearing room was bright and cold. Wooden benches, polished floor, a faint echo with every footstep. My husband sat at the defense table wearing a dark suit that hung loose on him now. He looked older, smaller, his hair thinner, skin pale under the fluorescent light. For a second, I almost didn't recognize him. Then he turned his head, and the eyes were the same. Calm, calculating. The same eyes that had watched me lift that glass of juice. I sat behind the prosecutor's table. The folder with my name on it felt heavier than it should have. When the judge entered, the room went still. They started with the evidence, simple facts lined up like bricks. The lab reports, the receipts, the surveillance footage from the hardware store. Each piece felt detached, clinical, but together they painted the full picture of what I'd lived through. Mills testified first. His voice was calm, professional. He explained the chemical analysis, the residue, the timeline. Then Ben spoke. How he'd helped me gather evidence, how he'd witnessed the confrontation at the cabin. His words were steady, stripped of emotion, but I saw his hand tremble when he mentioned the bottle shattering. When it was my turn, I walked to the stand slowly, trying not to look at anyone but the judge. My throat was dry. The prosecutor told me to take my time. I began with that night in the kitchen, the sound of the knife, the whisper in the hallway, the way my blood had turned to ice. I told them about the juice, the clinic, the motel, the car that followed. I told them everything, every quiet terror, every moment I'd swallowed fear just to keep breathing. The courtroom was silent. Even the air felt still. When the prosecutor asked how I'd realized it was him, I said it wasn't one thing. It was everything. The small lies, the cold eyes, the smile that never reached his face. Then I looked at him for the first time since that night. He didn't meet my gaze. His hands were folded, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the table. The defense tried to twist the story. Stress, depression, accidental contamination. They said he'd been overworked, that maybe someone else had handled the bottle. But every argument crumbled under the weight of the proof. The forensic expert confirmed it again. His fingerprints were on the cap, his handwriting on the note. When the closing statements ended, the judge called for recess. I stepped outside into the courtyard. The air was cool, the sky finally clearing after days of rain. Ben joined me quietly. He didn't say much, just stood beside me, hands in his pockets. After a long minute, he said, "You're almost there." Inside, the verdict came fast. Guilty, on all counts. The words hit me like the first breath after drowning. I sat very still while the judge read the sentence. 25 years, no chance of parole before 15. He didn't react. He just stood there, expression blank, eyes unfocused. When they led him out, he glanced at me once, brief, almost curious, like he was looking at a stranger, and maybe he was. I stayed in my seat long after the room emptied. The sound of footsteps faded, the gavel echoes dying in the air. For the first time, I realized there was no one left to chase me, no shadow waiting at the window. Ben waited at the door. He said Mills would handle the paperwork, that I was free to go. Free. The word sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. We walked out together into the bright afternoon. The reporters were still there, their questions like rain hitting glass. I didn't answer any of them. I just kept walking until the noise fell away behind me. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, I stopped. The air smelled clean, sharp with sunlight. I could hear traffic, laughter from somewhere down the street, the ordinary sounds of a world that had kept turning without me. For a moment I closed my eyes and just listened. Ben touched my arm lightly. "What now?" he asked. I looked at the sky, the pale blue stretching wide and empty. "Now," I said, "I start living again." We didn't speak after that. He drove me home, back to a house that was no longer a place of danger but a quiet ruin I needed to rebuild. The broken glass was gone, the walls scrubbed clean. Only the faint stain on the floor near the kitchen remained, like a scar the wood refused to forget. I didn't mind. Scars were proof that I'd survived. That night, I opened all the windows and let the wind move through the rooms. The air smelled of rain and pine and something close to peace. I made tea, sat by the table where it had all begun, and watched the light fade. For the first time in months, I didn't check the locks twice. I didn't listen for footsteps. The silence no longer frightened me. I wasn't waiting for anything to end. I was waiting for everything to begin. Months passed. The trial became a memory, something distant and unreal, like an old movie I'd watched too many times. The world didn't stop for me. It never does. People still went to work, laughed, complained about the weather. Somewhere between all that noise, I started to feel like part of it again. I sold the old house. I couldn't stay there, not with its shadows and echoes. The stain on the kitchen floor was gone, but the silence between the walls still carried his voice. I packed everything that mattered into a few boxes and left the rest behind. I moved to a smaller place near the coast. A town where the mornings smelled of salt and the evenings sounded like waves against rocks. The first night I slept there, I left the window open. The wind rattled the blinds, and instead of fear, I felt comfort. Every morning I walked to the pier with a cup of coffee and watched fishermen mend their nets. Nobody knew me there. Nobody looked twice. I liked that anonymity. It gave me space to breathe, to rebuild. At first I didn't know what to do with quiet days. I'd lived so long inside fear that peace felt foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. But slowly, I learned. I started reading again, small paperbacks from the thrift shop. I learned to paint clumsy pictures of the ocean. Sometimes I even laughed. Ben called every few weeks to check in. He never asked if I was okay. He just told me about his garden, the dog he adopted, the weather back home. It was his way of saying I wasn't forgotten. When we hung up, I always felt lighter. Mills wrote once saying the appeal had been denied, that the sentence would stand. He added that the case was now used in training, an example of how quick instincts and quiet courage could save a life. I read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and tucked it into a drawer. Life went on. Seasons changed, people came and went. I found a part-time job at a small bookstore near the harbor. The owner, a woman named Claire, gave me the morning shift because I liked the stillness before the city woke. She never asked about my past. I never offered it. Sometimes customers recognized me from old news stories, those small local segments that run between commercials. They would glance twice, unsure, then pretend they hadn't. I didn't mind. Let them wonder. Spring turned to summer. The sea warmed, the streets filled with tourists. One afternoon I saw a young couple arguing by the shore. Their voices were sharp, their faces flushed. The girl's hands shook as she spoke. For a second, my chest tightened. Then the boy softened, took her hand, and they both laughed. The tension vanished like it had never been. It reminded me that not all stories end in violence. Some people learn before they destroy. In late August, a letter arrived without a return address. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Inside was a single sentence. I hope the world has been kind to you. I stared at it for a long time. No signature, no plea. Just that. I didn't know if it came from him or from someone pretending to speak for him, but I didn't care. I walked down to the beach, tore the page in half, and let the wind carry it into the surf. Watching it drift away, I realized something simple. Forgiveness isn't about setting someone free. It's about releasing the weight they left inside you. That night, I dreamed for the first time without fear. I was standing in my kitchen again, sunlight pouring through the window, the table set, the air quiet. No whispers, no poison, no shadows, just warmth. When I woke, my pillow was wet, but I was smiling. I spent the next morning repainting the living room walls a pale color that reminded me of sea glass. I filled the shelves with books, small plants, seashells collected from my walks. The house began to look like it belonged to someone new. Every evening I watched the horizon change colors, gray to gold to soft blue, and thought about how far I'd come. Not in miles, but in breath, in stillness. Sometimes I still catch my reflection unexpectedly and see the woman I used to be. Scared, tired, silent. But she's fading, replaced by someone steady, someone who knows how close she came to disappearing and how fiercely she fought her way back. One night, as I locked up the bookstore, Claire handed me a small note. "You should sign up for the open mic reading next month," she said. "You've got stories in your eyes." I laughed, told her maybe. But that night, sitting by the window with the sea humming outside, I opened a notebook and began to write. Not about fear, not about death, about survival. The quiet kind that hides in small decisions. Tasting the air before you drink. Trusting the stranger who believes you. Walking toward the sunrise instead of hiding from it. The words came easily, simple and honest. By midnight, I'd written the last line and felt a calm I hadn't known since before that first whisper in the hallway. The world outside was asleep. Waves rolled against the rocks, steady as a heartbeat. I closed the notebook and whispered to the dark, "I made it." And for the first time, the silence answered back, soft, warm, alive. Autumn came quietly that year. The tourists left, the wind sharpened, and the sea grew darker, heavier. I liked it that way. The emptiness suited me. One evening, the sky turned violet before rain. I was closing the bookstore, counting bills by the soft hum of the heater, when the bell over the door rang. I looked up expecting Claire, but it was a man I'd never seen before. Tall, wrapped in a dark coat, still wet from the drizzle. He didn't speak right away, just glanced around the shop, running a hand across the shelves. Something about him felt out of rhythm, like a wrong note in a song. He asked if we carried true crime books. I said yes, pointed to the back corner. He smiled, faint and polite, and walked over. His shoes squeaked on the floorboards. I watched him pick up a paperback, the one about the trial, the case that used my name but changed everything else. He turned it over in his hands, studying the picture on the back. My chest tightened. He said quietly, without looking up, that he'd always found that story fascinating. How people can live beside monsters and never know until it's too late. I couldn't tell if it was a statement or a question. When he finally met my eyes, his expression was calm, unreadable. For a heartbeat, the air in the room felt too thin. Then he smiled again, smaller this time, almost kind, and placed the book on the counter. He paid in cash, thanked me, and left. Through the window, I watched him cross the street, his figure swallowed by the fog. For a long minute I stood there, listening to the bell above the door swing back and forth, back and forth. The rational part of me said he was just a stranger, a traveler, a customer drawn to a sensational story. But the small, careful part of me, the part that once listened through walls for whispers, stayed awake a little longer that night. Not afraid, just aware. Because safety isn't the absence of danger. It's the moment you realize you can face it and still keep breathing. Outside, the sea kept moving, dark and endless, carrying every secret away into the night. It happened almost 3 weeks after the man in the bookstore. Life had already settled into its slow rhythm again. Morning walks, coffee by the pier, evenings filled with quiet books and soft music. I had started to believe the past was finally behind me. That afternoon, the mail arrived late. I found the envelope in my box, no return address, no handwriting on the front except my name. Printed, not written. The paper was thick, smooth, the kind used for formal letters. Inside was a single photograph. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw it. My old house. The one I'd sold months ago. Same porch, same crooked tree by the gate. But it wasn't an old picture. The sky was overcast and the garden looked different. Someone had taken it recently. I felt that small, familiar chill crawl up my spine. Not fear, exactly, more like memory waking up. On the back of the photo was a faint stain, the color of amber, sticky, like a drop of something sweet. I didn't need to guess what it reminded me of. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for panic to come. It didn't. Instead, I made tea, sat by the open window, and let the sea wind move through the room. The photo lay on the table beside the cup. I studied every detail, the angle, the shadow, the reflection in the window of the house. There was no person visible, no car, nothing that told me who had taken it. It didn't matter. They wanted a reaction, fear, confusion, maybe guilt. But all I felt was quiet certainty that whoever still lingered in the edges of my story had already lost the power to change it. When the tea grew cold, I took the photo to the fireplace. The paper curled easily in the flame, turning gold, then black, then nothing. The faint smell of smoke and sugar filled the air. I watched until every trace of it was gone. Then I opened the window wider and let the ash drift out into the wind. The ocean outside was calm, the horizon soft and silver. Somewhere out there, the last pieces of the past scattered into the waves. Weightless, harmless, gone. I stood there a long while, breathing in the salt and smoke, and whispered something I hadn't said aloud before. Enough. The word felt clean, final. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed. The wind moved through the curtains like a slow heartbeat. I didn't dream of poison or voices or ghosts from the hallway. Only of firelight fading to dawn, and a house that finally, completely, belonged to no one but me.